Good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies. I'm very pleased to welcome you at this conference on the UN Global Compact on Migration and Human Rights. I'm Vincent Chetail, Professor of International Law and Founding Director of the Global Migration Center here at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. Let me open this conference with few words about the topic of our discussion today and focusing on the three key terms, key issues: migration, the Global Compact, and human rights. Next point, what about the Global Compact? The Global Compact for, and according to the official title, the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, all the contrary of what's happened today, has been initiated last September with the adoption of the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants by the General Assembly of the United Nations. The New York Declaration has raised some mixed comments. It has been labeled as a miracle, as historical momentum, or as a failure. And in fact, the success or the failure of the New York Declaration largely depends on what will be done this year and the next one. According to the New York Declaration, states have committed to launching a process of intergovernmental negotiations leading to the adoption of the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. The objective of the Global Compact is quite ambitious. It is to set out a range of principles and commitments addressing all aspects of migration. The Global Compact is intended to create a framework for a comprehensive international cooperation on migration and mobility. Negotiations toward this Global Compact will start this year and continue and finish next year. And at the end of this relatively short timeline, in fact, less than 2 years, at the end of this process, the Global Compact will be adopted by the UN General Assembly. And before the negotiations move forwards, it is critical that negotiators are fully aware of the existing obligations applicable to states. And this is my third and last point. What about human rights? What is the relevance of human rights for drafting the Global Compact? The centrality of human rights to frame migration is well acknowledged by the New York Declaration. The New York Declaration commits states to protect the human rights of migrants and the human rights of all migrants, regardless of their migratory status. And in fact, the Declaration repeats this duty to ensure human rights of migrants several times. And in fact, which as such is a most welcome acknowledgement. And in fact, the very term human rights is mentioned 30 times in the whole New York Declaration. That is more than once per page. But contrary to the New York Declaration and the Global Compact, human rights are legally binding. This is not the case of the New York Declaration, and this will not be the case of the Global Compact. So let's start from what is binding, and in this case, human rights. The main source of human rights is well known. The duties of states to respect for human rights are endorsed in a large number of general human rights treaties at the universal and regional level. At the universal level, of course, the two covenants, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the one on economic, social, and cultural rights, and so on. Even if these treaties are concluded for a general purpose, human rights conventions are crucial because they are generally applicable to everyone, irrespective of nationality, migration status, and they frequently include specific provisions on non-citizens. For instance, the Convention Against Torture with Article 3 prohibiting refoulement, the various provisions in the Convention on the Right of the Child, and so on. So human rights treaties provide a common frame of protection that is applicable to all migrants and supplemented by more specific conventional regimes. The more specific conventional regimes are based on two types of treaties. First, of course, the Geneva Convention relating to the status of refugees and its protocol of 1967. They detail the rights and duties of refugees in asylum states, and they are quite well ratified. I mean, at least 148 states have ratified one of these two treaties. The second type of specialized treaties are about migrant workers. The rights of migrant workers are governed by three specialized treaties at the universal level. The two ILO treaties concluded in 1949 and in 1975, and of course the UN Convention on the Right of Migrant Workers and Members of their Family. When compared to the refugee treaties, it is true that the three universal treaties on migrant workers still suffer from an uneven number of ratifications. However, to contend that migrant workers' treaties are irrelevant because they are not widely ratified is simply an urban legend. Why? Simply because no less than 87 states have ratified one or more of the three universal treaties devoted to migrant workers. This is not very well known, and this needs to be repeated again and again. Interestingly enough, among the 87 state parties to one or more of these three universal treaties, state parties are from all continents, and they include both countries of origin and countries of destinations, including 17 Western states. In short, migrant rights are solidly anchored within both general and specialized treaties on human rights, and these binding conventions must be the starting point of any solid discussion and negotiation process on the Global Compact. And this is the rationale of this conference. This conference aims to explore the potentials, opportunities, but also challenges of the relations between human rights and migration. And the idea was to gather a key expert on this central issue, both academics and experts from the UN. And I'm very pleased to have here with you a particularly solid panel of well-known experts. And maybe let's start with simply the best EU law expert of migration, namely Elspeth Gilt. Elspeth Gilt is a Jean Monnet Professor at Queen Mary University of London, as well as at Radboud University of Nijmegen, I'm sorry for the misspelling, in Netherlands. She is also visiting professor in several institutions, including the College of Europe in Bruges. And her interest and expertise lies mainly in the area of EU law governing migration and asylum, and she is used to provide advice to the European Parliament, the European Commission, the Council of Europe, and so on. And I must add more personally that this is to me not only a real pleasure to have you here, but also always a real pleasure to read you on this topic. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Vincent, for this very warm introduction, and also for inviting us and hosting us here in your institute, which is, of course, the place to be talking about the Global Compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration. And it's relationship with human rights. What is the objective of the UN Declaration? Well, there you are. It's the idea that there's a shared responsibility to manage large movements of refugees and migrants without a specific reference to human rights, but humane, sensitive, and compassionate and people-centered manner. When we are thinking about what kind of implementing measures we need in the two compacts which are going to be prepared, and I'll come back to that in a minute, we must remember what are these large movements of refugees and migrants. According to the UN World Tourism Organization, over 1.2 billion people cross international borders every year. The vast majority of those have no difficulty in traveling in a safe, orderly, and regular manner. And so if we're interested in thinking about what kind of realization of the New York Declaration we need in a global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration, we need to look at what causes unsafe, disorderly, and irregular migration. When 1.2 billion people have no difficulty, why are those who do have difficulties encountering these problems? How are we to achieve this? According to the New York Declaration, we're going to need a comprehensive policy and full respect for refugees and migrants' human rights and fundamental freedoms. What are the legal and political impacts of the compact? Well, I think we need to start perhaps with a short reflection on what are the legal and political impacts of a declaration by the General Assembly. What does the New York Declaration do? Well, it sets out the objectives in respect of migrants and refugees, and my particular concern is migrants and their human rights. Does it have legal and political impact? Well, it certainly has political impact, and states already, by having participated in the adoption of the resolution, have engaged themselves with an obligation to, at least at the political level, to protect the human rights of migrants. The question mark about what kind of legal impact the compact is going to have is also related with the legal impact of the New York Declaration. And it will be a matter of the discussions as to what this global compact will do. One of the things we may need to reflect on is what causes unsafe, disorderly, and irregular migration. And from a European perspective, looking at the tragedies in the Mediterranean, which have been ongoing for more than 10 years and intensifying with very little respite, irrespective of the amount of money which the European Union spends on the subject, it seems to me that if we're going to review our migration policies in respect of their unintended negative consequences, we will need to examine whether we need to disaggregate migration policy from border control. What are my final 3 lessons for us to remember as we begin this process of giving the New York resolution form and implementation through a global compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration? And the first is that having the nationality of another state does not justify worse treatment by states and companies than the treatment according to nationals of the state. That in itself is not enough. There must be, if there is going to be differential treatment, it must be justified. Secondly, aliens, if we call them in the language of the 1970s and before, aliens rather than migrants, Without national immigration documents, are human beings with human rights? You'll come back to that in a bit. And thirdly, the denial of rights, including to aliens, on the basis of colour, religion, or other prohibited grounds, is wrong. It's wrong in international law, it's wrong in international human rights law, and it is ethically unjustifiable. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Elspeth, for your very interesting and informative presentation. Let's continue with the discussion with a presentation focusing on the human rights of migrants in general, with two speakers, Catherine Allinson and Catherine Weatherhead. They are both PhD candidates at Queen Mary University of London. Catherine Allinson did, among many other things, LLM in International Human Rights Law at Queen Mary, with also a studied experience in the field of development charity. Catherine Weatherhead has also a master in international relations and law from Edinburgh University and a master in migration and forced migration studies from the University of Oxford.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you very much for having us here today. We're going to continue on from Elspeth's presentation looking at the human rights of migrants. I'm Catherine Allinson, and this is my colleague Catherine Weatherhead, and we do both work with Professor Gald at Queen Mary University of London. To facilitate clarity around the human rights of migrants, our presentation is structured around this syllogism. Firstly, we're going to underline that all people have human rights, and here we're going to look at the principle of non-discrimination. Secondly, we're going to argue that migrants are people, and here we're going to look at legal personhood and irregular status, two areas where migrants are severely constrained in receiving the protection of the law. And third, we underline that because of this, migrants do have human rights, despite the fact that they are often put in positions where they are challenged. And here we're going to use detention, specifically immigration detention, to illustrate ways in which the legal framework is undermined. So, to start, all people have human rights. And as I said, here we're looking at the principle of non-discrimination. The Human Rights Committee, in General Comment number 15, made this principle and its application to migrants explicitly clear. It says, the rights in this covenant apply to everyone, irrespective of their nationality or statelessness, and must be applied without discrimination between citizens and aliens. The assumption of non-discrimination is the foundation of the human rights framework. Rights are owed equally to everyone, based not upon nationality, but upon our common humanity. Article 2 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights also sets out the prohibition on discrimination. It stipulates that states must ensure rights to all individuals within its territory, without distinction of any kind, such as race, colour, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. The list of prohibited grounds of discrimination applies to all individuals within a state's territory, and this must therefore include migrants within the state's territory. And so, coming back to our syllogism, we've looked at the first part of it, that all people do have human rights. And under the principle of non-discrimination, the fact that someone is a migrant does not justify them being treated differently. All humans have human rights, and this is the fundamental characteristic that is at the core of human rights law. So, to come to the second part of our syllogism, migrants are people. Obviously, migrants are people, but as Elspeth said, they are also aliens. How does this contradiction in terms undermine the practical recognition that migrants are people? We're going to argue that this happens through the denial of legal personality, and secondly, through interpreting irregular status as putting individuals outside of the law. Denial of migrants as people in these ways can affect their ability to function as a person, to marry or secure formal employment, to obtain a driver's license, to open a bank account, to have access to social security or a pension, and significantly to be able to register one's own children. Legal personhood is central to the conception of human rights. It expresses the right and capacity of each human being to be the holder of rights and obligations under the law. It endows the individual with the right to have their status and capacity recognised in the legal order. Deprivation of an individual's capacity to be a person before the law has been described as civil death, because it degrades him or her to become an outlawed legal object, in contravention of Article 16 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This right is particularly important for migrants, because if they have lost or could not access their legal identity documents before leaving their home, or if those documents were damaged in transit, or if they're from a country where the documents are not up to the receiving state's standards, then they do not exist before the law. As a result, there is an obligation on receiving states to facilitate migrants becoming administratively visible through acknowledging documents from a migrant's homeland or replacing lost or damaged documents.
So, as Catherine has highlighted, the issue of identity documents is one area which challenges the recognition of migrants as people. However, irregular status does not deprive a migrant of the protection of international law. As noted earlier, human rights law applies to everyone. The treaty bodies have accordingly affirmed the irrelevancy of irregular status under human rights law. For example, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women has noted that all categories of women migrants fall within the scope of the obligations of states. The Committee on the Rights of the Child has stated that the enjoyment of rights is to be available to all children, irrespective of their nationality, immigration status, or statelessness. And as a further example, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination has noted that states are to ensure that legislative guarantees against racial discrimination apply to non-citizens regardless of their immigration status. There are very limited exceptions to equal treatment between citizens and irregular migrants. Under the Civil and Political Covenant, voting rights need only be guaranteed to citizens, and rights to free movement need only be guaranteed to individuals who are regularly present. Irregular status does not nullify the applicability of all other human rights provisions. Finally, having established that all people are owed human rights and that migrants are people, we come to the final part of our syllogism: migrants have human rights. Migrants hold a multitude of human rights under the international treaties. However, there are situations where migrants' rights are violated so severely that we begin to question whether they have rights at all. Here we briefly look at practices of immigration detention as an illustration. So, under international law, everyone has a right to be free from arbitrary detention. Arbitrariness, as interpreted by the Human Rights Committee, includes inappropriateness, injustice, lack of predictability, and lack of due process of law. Examples of arbitrary detention are when there is a lack of justification in each individual case, when detention is indefinite in duration, when there is a lack of judicial review, and when detention is on a prohibited ground of discrimination, such as religion. Any use of detention must be a proportionate act to achieve a legitimate aim. But even when not arbitrary, detention can still violate a range of human rights due to poor conditions. Conditions must not amount to inhuman or degrading treatment, which can be caused, for example, through severe overcrowding. Detained migrants must also have effective access to their rights of family life, education, and healthcare. Attention must also be given to groups with specific needs. So women require separate facilities. People with mental disabilities require access to appropriate services, and children should not be detained. And by way of conclusion, let's go back to our initial question. What are the human rights of migrants? Through this syllogism, we have shown the legal entitlement of migrants to human rights, despite the obstacles they face in enjoying those rights. And in terms of the development of the Global Compact, the statement, migrants have human rights, should not be subject to contestation and question in practice. Instead, it should be acted upon as part of a state's obligations under international law, obligations that they created and which they reaffirmed in the New York Declaration. I'd like to thank you for your attention.
So let's continue with another presentation from the perspective of the UN, and in particular from the perspective of the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I'm very pleased to have with us Carolina Hernandez, who is a Human Rights Officer at the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And your work mainly is focusing on the human rights of migrants from various perspectives. And you have also worked previously, prior joining the High Commissioner Office. You worked as attorney, researcher, and expert consultant. You really know the topic, and this is important to learn more from you and from the perspective of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vincent. Good afternoon, everyone. Colleagues and friends, and let me first start to saying that it's a great pleasure for me to address this important discussion on the Global Compact on Migration and Human Rights, and by thanking the Global Migration Centre and the Queen Mary University of London for organizing this very timely discussion and inviting the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to share its views on how to ensure the inclusion of the human rights of migrants within the Global Compact. Migration can indeed, as has been stressed today, be a positive and empowering experience for individuals and communities, and can bring social, cultural, and economic benefits to societies in countries of origin, transit, and destination. But it is clear today that the kind of precarious migration that we're increasingly witnessing along migratory routes, at borders, and in precarious sectors within countries is a serious human rights concern. As the High Commissioner for Human Rights has repeatedly stressed, when hundreds of thousands of people put their lives and the lives of their children at risk, it is safe to assume that they feel that they have no other choice. The vast majority of those caught up in these unprotected movements are not moving voluntarily in the true sense of that term. Refugees are fleeing persecution or conflict. Other migrants are fleeing drivers no less perilous to human rights dignity, such as biting poverty, discrimination, the grief of family separation, lack of access to fundamental human rights, such as education, health, adequate food, or decent work, as well as the wide-ranging consequences of natural disasters, climate change, and environmental degradation. For migrants in vulnerable situations, migration is too often dangerous and discriminatory. It is, in fact, the very opposite of the subject of the Global Compact on Migration. It is not safe, it is not rights-respecting. It is precisely for this reason that in order to assist states and other stakeholders to develop, implement, and monitor measures to protect the human rights of migrants in vulnerable situations, that the Global Migration Group, the interagency mechanism, is in an initiative co-chaired by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and UN Women, is developing a set of principles and practical guidance on human rights protection of migrants in vulnerable situations. A process which has been recognized in the New York Declaration and to which we would like to invite you today to engage by providing comments to the draft. Indeed, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights believes that the New York Declaration is a human rights-based commitment to people on the move. It contains 30 specific references, but in general, over 100 explicit references to human rights, as well both in the Declaration and in both annexes, as well as concrete commitments to uphold international human rights law and other relevant standards. After years of approaching migration as an issue related to national sovereignty to be addressed primarily through national approaches, states have now recognized that better global cooperation and governance on migration is needed. They thus decided to launch this major intergovernmental process under the auspices of the United Nations to craft a global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration by 2018, which would set out the principles, commitments, and understandings among states regarding international migration in all its dimensions. Our main challenge going forward is to translate these aspirational words of the summit and the New York Declaration into a concrete plan of action. The proposed Global Compact on Safe Migration can provide that concrete plan if we get it right. What is clear is that we have moved beyond a discussion on whether or not human rights apply to a discussion on how human rights are to be upheld, how the Global Compact can make migration safer for all. Colleagues, on the part of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, we think that to remain true to the promise of the New York Declaration and to the existing human rights obligations of states, the Global Compact should strive to foster a human rights-based approach to migration, premises on the principles of universality, participation, non-discrimination, and accountability, rooted in law and founded on rights. For this, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights believes that the compact will need to be based on the following building blocks. The first is the primacy of human rights. As has been stated today, every migrant is a rights holder, entitled to specific human rights protection, regardless of the motives people have for crossing international borders, how they do so, and where they are. Our second point is that the Global Compact must be firmly based on the legal obligations of states and other stakeholders, using the international legal framework as a guide to develop meaningful and action-oriented commitments for action. A key step towards ensuring migration policies that are grounded in human rights norms and standards is to ratify and implement all international and regional human rights instruments and related conventions, and to reaffirm in policy and in practice the fundamental importance of respecting, protecting, and fulfilling the human rights of all migrants. Our third building block is the need to include an explicit human rights thread that will run through the overall process to reaffirm and articulate how the existing normative framework applies to all aspects of migration and all categories of migrants. And then finally, the process should accommodate a participatory and multi-stakeholder approach with the engagement of states at the national and local level, of UN agencies and related organizations at the global and field levels, of the UN human rights mechanisms, civil society organizations, trade unions, national human rights institutions, academic institutions, and crucially, the voices of migrants themselves. For the preparation of the first thematic session on the human rights of all migrants, OHCHR, along with IOM, have taken the lead on the preparation of a draft procedural concept note as part of a core group that has been established by the Office of the President of the General Assembly. And the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has also taken the lead within a collaborative interagency process of the Global Migration Group in preparing the draft issues brief that the new Special Representative of the Secretary General, Mrs. Louise Arbour, will submit in advance of this first thematic session. These briefs will, in general, provide key trends, key normative and policy issues that the Global Compact may need to address, and a vision on the way forward, including a set of suggested commitments that could be made by states within the Global Compact. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights will strive to ensure, along with partners in the UN system, that the first and all other thematic sessions and all phases of this process are human rights-based and migrant-centered. Indeed, in keeping with the overarching understanding of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, the Global Compact on Migration must explicitly ensure that no one is left behind. We will not have succeeded in our task if at the end of this process we fail meaningfully to address human rights protection gaps for migrants.
Thank you very much, Carolina, for your presentation. When I was hearing you, I'm a little bit more positive than you, but this is perhaps because I'm not within the UN.
Thank you so much. You have the misfortune of catching me on a day where I, for some reason, is feverish. I'm feverish. So if I all of a sudden faint, it is not because the excitement of the Global Compact has just gotten to me. It's because I did not put on a sweater when I was gardening over this weekend. That said, I hope that I will make somewhat sense. If not, just put it down to that. And those of you who know that I rarely make sense, just don't tell anybody else. So if we just look at the Global Compact, I have the feeling that a number of you today came here with the hope that we would tell you what it would look like. Now, I don't know if you have already detected that you are going to be disappointed in that, because we are still grasping about what will it actually look like. Only a few weeks ago, I had a discussion with the Special Rapporteur on Migrants' Rights on the Global Compact, and it took us 10 minutes before we sort of tentatively looked at each other and said, it is going to be a piece of paper, right? And we're like, yes, I think it is. So let's think that it is going to be something that's going to be put on paper. And also let's say that it will be firmly anchored in the existing legal framework, which is what Vincent seems to be convinced about. Another thing about us not really knowing yet what it's going to look like is, and here I would like to echo what Carolina ended up by saying, is that we can still influence it, and you can still influence it. So I think it is very important that academic institutions, civil society, migrants associations, name it, are actually involved in these negotiations. Because even if it will be a state-led process, it's still important to have many voices who are advocating for including and firmly basing the Global Compact on rights. Not so long ago, I was at a conference where I was speaking about the international legal framework on migration, great surprise, and at a reception just before, one of my fellow panelists said, oh, but is there such a legal framework? And before I even had the time to respond, which was probably a good thing, somebody else said, yes, but it's true when it comes to migrants, then it becomes soft law. Unfortunately, then I did have the time to reply, and I used words that no lady should even know. Because there is this tendency to not understand that, legally speaking, migrants have the same rights as everybody else, apart from two, the right to vote and to freedom of movement if you're not a regular resident. And that also goes to somehow demystifying what the international legal framework actually is. And again, that goes back to the practicality of the Global Compact. If the Global Compact as a non-binding instrument comes out and shows what is implementation of the international framework, what are the ways forward? Could it be as in goals or in best practices? That is also a way of telling people what rights actually are, what the international legal framework is, and why it has a meaning for each and every one of us every day. If we walk around the streets of Geneva in peace, if we have a bed, a house, food, if we're warm, it's because the international legal framework is respected for us. And we need to make sure that that concrete implementation and concrete respect for rights is implemented for everybody. But we also need to communicate better why international rights and international standards are so crucial for each one of us. So we need to speak a language that gets people behind this project. And the practicality of the Global Compact might in that sense be a very good thing. We also need to link the rights of migrants, I think, to the broader discussion of rights of everybody and the importance of the multilateral setting, which I think we need to face these days is a little bit under attack. And in that sense, also the Global Compact takes on an added importance, because discussing exactly this group of people within the UN in the Global Compact context makes it very important to realize this importance of the multilateral framework that we have today. If we want to see the Global Compact as practical implementations, solutions, then we can look at what are the best practices around the world. Canada springs to mind these days, but it's not the only one. And try to really show how a rights-based approach is not a threat to sovereignty. On the contrary, it makes for better governance and better migration management. As Albert said, we need to look at what causes unsafe migration, not only for the sake of the migrants, but for the sake of societies. If we have irregular, unsafe migration, it is costly for societies, not only for the migrants who suffer. And we need to learn. We need to learn from history. We need to learn and see that trying to block migration has never and will never work. And we need to learn from the cost that we see today. We need to learn, look and see what we are doing wrong, and try to then do better. We also need to avoid creating more migration crises and avoid creating more vulnerability. Because if we don't open up for legal channels for migration based on the rights we have in the international legal framework, what we're doing excuse me, is that we are pushing people into the hands of smugglers, into the hands of traffickers, the exact organized criminal networks that we also want to fight. Detention was mentioned in a previous presentation. And I would actually go as far as to say that most migration detention today is arbitrary and thus unlawful, because it does not meet the criteria of last resort, and it does not meet the criteria of least intrusive measure. There is no individual assessment that the people held in migration detention today actually need to be held in migration detention. But there are numerous alternatives available. And states are more and more interested in implementing these alternatives also because they realize that having detention is very costly. It's not only a question of protecting the rights, it's also a question of looking at what does not protecting the rights of individuals actually cost societies. So looking at best practices for alternatives to detention is one very concrete way of having a rights-based approach in the Global Compact. It creates less cohesion, it creates marginalized groups, and also the employers who do not obey the rule of law and do not obey national labor legislation are, per definition, and also, for instance, not paying their taxes. I'm not talking about migrants, I'm talking about the employers, because they're not operating within the national legal framework. And that brings me also to another point, that perhaps in demystifying what international law is, remember that in most cases, international standards are already reflected in national practice, in national standards. Most enforcement of international standards are done by national courts, by national entities, because most national legislation does live up to the international standards already. So it is really a question more of looking at the implementation. I also think we need to say, yes, the Global Compact is not going to be a binding instrument, but it is firmly based in negotiated outcomes. Negotiated outcomes being the treaties that states have signed up to. And when I emphasize negotiated outcomes, it's because international treaties, be they on human rights, or on the law of the sea, or on refugee protection, or on transnational criminal law, do not drop from heaven from one day to another. They have been negotiated by states. States have agreed to them. That's why it takes forever to create a treaty. Okay? So it is not just something that the UN as an entity decides to come and tell states to obey. It is something that states themselves have negotiated. And if you look at the international legal framework, it's a very pragmatic legal framework. It does not request some utopian state to appear from one day to the other. It is firmly based in what is actually possible to achieve. A human rights or rights-based framework for migration would ensure the application of these obligations to migrants to protect them from abuse, but it will also ensure that societies will benefit from migration because nobody would be marginalized in the labor sector. Employers would be a lot less tempted to abuse and exploit irregular and regular migrants.
Thank you very much, Christina. As usual, I totally agree with you. The human rights-based approach is not a threat to state sovereignty, of course. I mean, this is even the very, and perhaps today, the only basis of its legitimacy. So at some point, if the state is unable to protect basic rights, there is a question, we have to question the rationale of the state. But human rights is implemented by states, and states are, from the perspective of international law at least, the main actor and guarantor of basic rights. And clearly the main gap today is implementation. This is the issue, the key issue. Rules do exist. Clearly they are not well known for many, but they are. And the key issue today is to make sure that they are understood properly and implemented as such. And from this perspective, we have probably some lessons to learn from UNHCR and refugee law, because, of course, traditionally, refugee law is relatively slightly different, but more detailed regime as based on the Geneva Convention at least. And this is my pleasure here to have Madeleine Garlick. Madeleine is the Chief of the Protection Policy and Legal Advice section in, this is a long title, and this is not finished, in the Division of International Protection of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Congratulations. Yeah. And you previously worked, of course, in various places as UNHCR liaison for the EU, but also in Cyprus, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and so on. And you are a very important expert to explain the interaction between the two covenants and what will be the room for improving convergence between the two. Because after all, as Carolina explained, the distinction between refugees and migrant workers is quite simple and simplistic. I mean, we, as individuals, you are a husband, an employee, a father, and these categories are not exclusive the one from the others. So fortunately, refugees are workers, and sometimes, unfortunately, migrant workers can become refugees. So I think it would be great to have your views from this.
Thank you very much, Vincent, and I'd like to thank also the Graduate Institute and Queen Mary for inviting me along today to speak on this distinguished panel. We sincerely appreciate the opportunity as UNHCR to take part in this discussion on the Migration Compact, not only because we've been invited by member states in the New York Declaration to contribute to the development of the Global Compact on migration, but for at least 3 other important reasons that I can think of. Firstly, because UNHCR is deeply committed to working to try and support further reinforcement of respect for the rights of migrants. Secondly, because this has to be a part of dealing with today's realities around cross-border movements. Refugees, of course, in many, many cases are moving alongside migrants. In many cases, indeed, there are very close similarities between their situations. And many of them are facing extremely dangerous circumstances as they seek to reach countries into which they can be admitted in safety. And thirdly, I think it's extremely clear today that refugees' protection needs cannot be addressed effectively without more effective migration governance and a clearer legal framework which can ensure greater cooperation between states, but much more effective enforcement of the human rights of migrants. And in this context, I think we have to recall then that the New York Declaration in many ways is a very important achievement. There are some people who've criticised it for not putting forward enough new elements, for leaving gaps, for perhaps not being ambitious enough. But there, amongst its many other important features, I think there's two that need to be recalled. Firstly, that it reaffirms and restates some very crucial principles of international law, things that might indeed seem self-evident for some of us in this room, but things which have been called into question, not only in electoral speeches, but within parliaments and in active political debates in a number of countries from which many of us come today. And secondly, of course, it has expressly articulated states' readiness and intention to do more, including to work towards greater and more effective sharing of responsibilities amongst them for refugee protection and for ensuring more effective respect for the rights of migrants. I'll speak briefly, first of all, about the way in which the New York Declaration addresses refugees in particular. And I want to do this because whilst recognising that migrants and refugees are often moving and subsisting in very similar circumstances, refugees are addressed in very specific terms in the New York Declaration. And this, in our view, is necessary and important because refugees are affected specifically by the failure or absence of state protection. And they may need it, in that case then, from the international communities in ways which at least some categories of migrants may not. So rather than responding to refugee displacement through a purely and often under-resourced humanitarian engagement, the CRF is designed to provide a more systematic and sustainable response that will benefit both refugees, their hosts, and the international community more broadly. It signals a shift in the way in which UNHCR and the international community, we hope, are going to respond to large-scale movements of refugees in future. And this is, amongst other things, because it seeks to engage a much wider array of stakeholders in a whole-of-society approach, which includes not only national authorities of all levels of government, but also international financial institutions, civil society partners, who are some of the most important actors in many refugee situations, as well as refugees themselves, who must be the ones who can best inform our efforts to try and reform, improve, and strengthen responses in future. It seeks also to encourage and embrace investment and innovation through private sector engagement, through encouraging more diverse approaches to investment and innovative approaches to delivering humanitarian assistance where it's needed. But furthermore, it also wants to seek to put solutions planning first, to initiate long-term planning solutions by building in development as well as humanitarian actions and to the outset of a response to situations that run the risk of becoming protracted otherwise, in order to ensure that host communities are also supported in dealing with challenges, as well as foreseeing an end to a refugee situation, which will mean that people are going to be able to resume or rebuild or establish new lives elsewhere. The Declaration calls upon UNHCR to develop and apply the CRF in particular situations in close coordination with concerned states and involving other stakeholders, including UN agencies, but many other partners. We're seeking now to broaden the range of partners with whom we're working, and some of these new partners include the World Bank, the International Labour Organization, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, as well as the Global Partnership on Education, in addition to our traditional partners, the OHCHR, IOM, and other parts of the UN who have long been part of our network. Going back to the New York Declaration, we have then, of course, at the end of Annex 1 also a call for the High Commissioner for Refugees to propose a global compact on refugees in his annual report to the General Assembly next year. Amongst other things, this should be based on the lessons learned from the practical application of the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, as well as an assessment based on the lessons learned of how it could be further refined and developed as a concrete means and framework for implementation of refugee protection principles concretely on the ground. But also pivotal to this is the means to ensure that states can share responsibility more effectively, looking at countries of origin, transit and destination, to ensure that refugee crises can be not only responded to more effectively, but where possible also avoided. Ways in which this can be achieved include potentially through the establishment of standby arrangements, partnerships, as well as operational commitments, which we hope will cover, for example, deployment of technical expertise on the part of states, use of funding reserves in certain circumstances, activation of emergency resettlement quotas, which do not need to be decided upon years in advance, or mechanisms to trigger increased donor funding. The second part of the Global Compact on Refugees is going to be a program of action that is designed to set out some of the concrete actions that can be taken at quite a detailed level, both by member states of the UN, but also others, to operationalise the principles expressed in New York and the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework itself. In terms of the process of work towards this Global Compact, there's going to be preparatory activity in 3 interrelated areas. Firstly, the implementation of the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework in the countries which have already stepped forward, and others with which we're involved in detailed discussions now. And we hope that, think it's important to underline that in line with the multi-stakeholder approach that New York seeks to express, this is not purely a UNHCR effort. It can't be made to work without all of those others who have expertise and who have mandates and experience to contribute to this undertaking. As a second part of the process, there's going to be a series of thematic discussions that are going to seek to address all of the aspects of the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework in their thematic terms, namely on reception and admission to territory, secondly on support for immediate and ongoing needs, thirdly support for host countries and communities, and finally on durable solutions and how these can be achieved in a wider variety and more effective ways. There will thereafter, in February of next year, be a 0 draft of the Global Compact on Refugees, which will be circulated, followed by a process of formal consultations with states, but also with other stakeholders and interested parties. And there's a series of themes and a rough timetable that's been already mapped out for the course of next year. And there's also then thereafter going to be attached to the High Commissioner's report to the Secretary General ahead of the General Assembly next year, a text of the Global Compact, which will be put forward then to the General Assembly for its consideration and adoption. The 2 Global Compacts thus have very important starting points and different objectives, so it makes sense for them to be separate, distinct and independent, but we believe that a rights-focused approach must characterise and drive both, and we believe that the commitments to enhanced responsibility sharing that states have expressed in New York can and must, in our view, mean that the 2 processes should reinforce and build upon each other. The processes now in working towards the 2 Global Compacts are an opportunity for us to exercise those choices in a very important and we hope consequential way. And this must, in our view then, be a choice which is made with a very clear anchoring and base in the human rights framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madeleine, for this very informative presentation, and clearly the Global Compact on Refugee is taken seriously by UNHCR, and I'm happy to see that there are many also collaborations with many stakeholders. I have the pleasure now to conclude this conference to welcome Martin Geiger, who is Assistant Professor of Politics of Human Migration and Mobility at Carleton University, and his research focuses on the role of international organizations, private companies, and NGOs in migration and refugee politics. And he has, of course, extensive empirical research experience and also has published several books on this important issue. Please, Martin.
Thanks so much, merci, and good afternoon, and thanks for including me in this highly relevant and timely discussion today. Speaking of inclusiveness and participation, I would really like to give over the microphone already to you and start engaging in the discussion. Bear with me, I have another 15-20 minutes and I hope it's going to be very interesting. And I think my role today is a bit summarizing what we just heard, but I guess I would also like to put my finger a few wounds and a few critical points hearing and listening what was presented today, and also what I have been researching over the last 10, 15 years in terms of what is done to manage and regulate migration. So in this presentation, one of the key arguments I will make is in favor of a principled, rights-based approach, not only to refugees, but also to migrants, and that was alluded to various times today already. Migrants also leave their homes for all kinds of reasons, including to survive economically or having so-called mixed motives, and cannot be blamed to have these mixed motives and other motives. Another key point I will make today, how does this work actually? How can I? All right, yeah. Another key point I will make today is that it is really high time to finally realize and deliver good migration governance that is working. So the UN compacts on refugees and migration are definitely new steps ahead and new milestones in the global collaboration on flows of people. I don't want to dispute that. There is, however, they are based on an emerging consensus that refugees and migration are a global reality and shared responsibility. And this is definitely nothing new. We have this discussion since at least 30 years now. So I want to take you a bit back in a second to the 90s, and perhaps we could start even earlier in time, especially if we talk about Europe, where we are currently situated. What is really new and different in the global compacts, and how can these compacts really make a difference? So I'll take you back. Usually the reference point is always the GCIM and the 2000s. I take you back to the 90s, the Commission on Global Governance. And you see this very interesting definition that has come up, and some of you might have learned that for your class exams. What governance is supposed to be. Bringing together varieties of stakeholders, private and public, conflicting or diverse interests, to accommodate these and to take cooperative action. Also, very interestingly, it mentions formal institutions, regimes, binding nature, empowered to reinforce compliance, as well as informal arrangement that people and institutions have agreed to or perceive to be in their interest. So I ask again, what is really new? What stands out today? So these things came up in a similar time of crisis, the early 90s, when many thought there needs to be more orderly, well-managed, safe, and regular migration. Migration flows are a global reality, definitely. What is very interesting, in the early 90s, we came to have done a project called the New International Regime for Orderly Movements of People, 1993. Today we stand at 2017. Bimal Ghosh, who pioneered this project, I'm very often in correspondence with him, and we reflect actually what has happened since then. And I'll include a few comments here. What I learned from discussing this with him. I think what we had and what the problem is we did have more management instead of governance, of principle norm-based governance. And I think we need to shift back and turn back the wheel more back to government and governance again. Why not, of course, not giving up what has been achieved over the last years by including more strongly and more genuinely civil society, NGOs, private interests, public interests, the global citizenry. So interestingly, this project, NIROM, came up with 3 principal pillars. A balanced approach to realize migration as a normal process and not to scandalize migration ever and ever again. A regulated openness, that is, how do we make sure that the activities are checked upon, who is accountable if something goes wrong? Simply this easy question. And I think constant evaluation, and I think I welcome that the New York Declaration calls for actually constant evaluations again and clear ways of checking up what is happening and to learn from mistakes, to have actually a learning element in it. So be precise, terminologies and approaches, be clear about the responsibilities, and then the compacts come with this the clear commitment, at least verbally in this convention, about define and commit to outcomes. So let's talk about outcomes. If you talk with diplomats, they always tell you you need first some low-hanging fruits that are easy to give out, easily to achievable on a short term. So what could be short-term achievements, and what is probably the problem with medium and long-term commitments? So who is involved? Make sure genuine inclusiveness. I don't think that should be disputed anymore. It's simply 2017. So there needs also global accountability. I think we have heard a lot in the media about what has gone wrong. There is unfortunately no discussion why some certain things have gone wrong in managing the migration crisis. States look very helpless. Even institutions that over the last few years have received considerable funding and have proved completely helpless. And actually, that is a problem, I think, that we would also, as taxpayer or as states, really make sure that we invoke programs, we finance organizations that carry out certain activities, that we really make sure that there are also tangible outcomes delivered for that money. The leadership question. I didn't really hear it today. We didn't talk about the US. And I think one thing that the New York Declaration came up last year, well, some people that have been participating told me that was a bit the last moment they were able to catch under the Obama administration, and some people were already afraid that there might be someone else elected. So I think it is really interesting what's going to happen to the Global Compact decisions. Are countries like Germany, Canada, and also perhaps non-traditional alien coalition partners of these countries stepping up, taking over, or do we end up in crisis mode operations again? So think again about language, meaning, and goals, and who is responsible and who has actually ownership. I think it is very important to stress that many countries have not really taken over ownership over some processes. They very easily take over ownership when it's about protecting the border, and that is like acknowledged, and that is something they are really easily to be convinced by the other international community. But I think its ownership on migration policy means much more than only defending the border or stepping up border guards. So as to conclude, I think migration management should become good government and good governance again, and then really we should make it work. So there are new alliances needed, real commitments needed, and they need also to be delivered. It is simply 2017. We had these discussions a few times already. While there has been definitely progress, and I welcome these developments, I think it is really, really clear that we need also now to move a step forward. Global dialogue, I think, on migration is essential. It's absolutely necessary. It's actually also possible. It's complicated, yes. It's issue-loaded. Many countries have actually preferred over the last years to discuss migration rather in the back room and in a very informal, non-binding way again, right? And I think that we today stand yet another crisis, or the next crisis is then foreseeable, has a bit to do that we didn't really properly prepare our population, our citizenry, that migration is simply a fact. And unfortunately, also refugee movements and displacements are a global fact. And we need to deal with these consequences, and we need to deal with these processes. And I think why some politicians avoid discussing these issues because they are afraid of right-wing politicians taking over the debate. It is wrong to actually wait and see, and then politicians of that kind of couleur take over and cash in on this debate. And I think this is very important. I want to conclude here, and thanks so much for inviting me again.
First of all, let's finish positive notes. The New York Declaration mentioned the human rights of migrants more frequently than any other declaration of the UN General Assembly so far. Okay, so the minimum we should expect is to have in fact the same number of robust, clear-cut references to the human rights of migrants. Thank you very much for being here, and the cocktail is just on your left. Thank you.